Okay, hopefully that, yes, okay. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We missed you. We hope you had a lovely summer. Judging by the numbers, you missed us too, so that's good. Lirad and I are starting, well, it's the same from the Grown Up series, but this time we're focusing on projects. And the idea behind it is to create this inventory of behind the scenes stories. We reached out to developers, our colleagues, our clients to share the stories behind projects that were already approved, already built. And we focused on three lenses: acquisitions, municipal approvals, and construction. And Lirad, please introduce our guest speaker today.
Yes. Well, we have Mr. Alex Spiegel joining us again, and he's very special. He's joining us for the second time today in our series. And Alex runs Windmill Developments. And we're very excited to get started. And today we're focusing on The Plant, which is a project near the Queen and Dovercourt area. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Alex.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on this program. I think it's a great thing you guys are doing as an educational endeavor and just as a networking project really in the community. And it's been great through this difficult time to at least have this platform to communicate and to have conversations. So thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. I'll just give a very quick overview of the project and then we can get into more detailed conversation. So let me share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Yes? All good? Okay. So yes, I'm a partner in Windmill Developments. Windmill is actually based in Ottawa and also has a Toronto office. So I'm very involved in the Toronto projects, and also we have number of projects in Ottawa. Project we're going to talk about today is called The Plant at 41 Dovercourt, just south of Queen. And it was actually a joint venture between Windmill Developments and Curated Properties, who turned out were our neighbors to the north on Dovercourt. And through the approvals process, we got to know them and actually asked them to be our partner on the project. So just to give you a very quick overview, the project follows a One Planet Living framework of sustainability, which includes both environmental sustainability as well as cultural and social sustainability. So we basically designed the project with these 10 principles in mind. We think the One Planet Living framework is a great holistic way of approaching all development, and all of our projects follow this platform. As mentioned, the project's located in the Queen West Triangle, just south of Queen, north of King on Dovercourt, at the confluence of two really important bicycle networks. So the West Toronto rail path will eventually be extended right down to Sudbury Street, and the Adelaide and Richmond East-West urban network will join at this point. So it's very important because of our sustainability focus to have walkable location, and also a location that's not car dependent, but rather bicycle dependent. Oops, go back. Again, this shows the location. There's a future smart track station going to happen right across the street on Sudbury. This red line, this red mark shows the 41 Dovercourt site. It's right at the foot of Dovercourt where it turns onto Sudbury Street. The site was originally Deflet Pastries. Deflet had moved out to the Etobicoke area and had leased the building to a different food operator. That food operator, again, grew out of the building and moved somewhere else. So it was a vacant industrial building when we took it over. This is a rendering of the project. It's a 10-story building, mixed use. The ground 2 floors are commercial, so the retail at grade, office on the 2nd floor, and 8 stories of residential above. A big focus of the project was urban agriculture and growing healthy food on your balcony and in the communal spaces. So because of the podium, we have quite a large 3rd floor terrace. The amenity space, it goes onto that terrace and includes both a communal kitchen and a greenhouse for getting an early start to planting, as well as communal gardens. The balconies were all quite generous, all oversized balconies, again, to encourage people to grow their own food. Food was a major theme for the project, both because of the history of the site and also, again, wanting to encourage urban agriculture, both from a health perspective as well as to build community in the building. We had container gardens even before we started the project on site and donated that food to a local food bank. These are some renderings of the amenity space that shows the communal kitchen, the greenhouse wall facing south, and the outdoor communal gardens that are available for the residents of the building. This shows our neighbor to the north. I'll get into this when we talk about approvals, but we had a very interesting process through the approvals process, a very interesting conversation with our neighbors to the north, and worked out what could have potentially been a conflict into a mutually beneficial arrangement where we actually added density in between the buildings, added a bay on the north side of our building, which allowed it to step down to meet the neighboring building to the north, and in the process created this lovely light well that became a feature and is a feature in the lobby of the building. So I can get into that discussion more when we talk about the approvals process. Again, here's a rendering of the building on the bottom right, and the top left is a photograph from a couple months ago. The ground floor is still under construction, but it just shows the actual building as it's now completed or just about complete, and it still looks like the rendering, which is a good thing. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and away we go.
Well, I have to commend you and your team for building beautiful building, and I love that it's not your typical cookie cutter condo and has a really unique angle to it that enhances the community and the lifestyle of the residents. So congratulations. So why don't we start by early stages with the acquisition. It was a pretty unique story with your relationship with the original owner of the land, Dufflet. So why don't you take us through that process and how you came about acquiring the land eventually?
It is an interesting story. So Dufflet had contacted me in 2012, so quite a while ago, and was interested in looking at development opportunities for the site. Her husband is Marty Cohn of Cohn Architects, so very talented designer. And so the three of us kind of sat down and brainstormed a little bit about what the site could be. At that point, the Queen West Triangle area had been redesignated from employment lands to regeneration area. So there was a lot of development that happened in the Queen West Triangle. And I had actually been quite involved with the group called Active 18, which was advocating back in the day for a much more contextual type of development there, which unfortunately didn't happen. There was a lot of, I would say, commodity type development that happened in the Queen West Triangle. It could have been much better, but through that process, got to know the community quite well. And so we developed a design approach for her, with me working as a consultant, to really reimagine the site as a mixed-use building. We wanted to include an employment component in the building as a recognition of the employment history of the area, not just a strictly residential building. So it was always going to be a mixed-use building. And working with Marty, who's, as I say, very talented designer, came up with various plans to redevelop the site. And that process went on for 2 or 3 years until she actually decided to sell the property, at which point we were sort of the natural, I guess, purchasers, since we'd already developed that relationship with her. And although there were some bumps along the way, Windmill in the end did purchase the property from Dufflet with the idea to redevelop it along the lines that we had conceived of through the early stages as a consultant. I should add that acquisitions are a huge challenge in the city of Toronto. I mean, I'm sure many of the people who are listening would agree. It's a very competitive environment. It's very hard to find sites. We're actively looking for sites all the time. And so for us, it was actually a real benefit. It is a real benefit often to work as a consultant or an advisor to landowners, develop a relationship and a sense of trust. And that often gives us a sort of an open door to then hopefully acquire the site and actually implement what we've recommended as consultants.
And I'm sure the audience will. Sorry, I just dropped my mic, literally. So I'm sure the audience will have more questions. And guys, please, by the way, feel free to type your questions, Alex, and us will see them. I want to cover the next one, approvals. And maybe I should actually ask you to just share the story, but I read the planning reports and you submitted for 13 stories, your first submission, then it got approved at 10. And the site, it's regeneration, it's not designated mixed use, it's not an avenue. And it's really one of those scenarios when it's really unclear what height should it be. You have tall buildings, and context is everything, of course. You have taller buildings to the west, to the north. Tell us about the approvals and maybe focus a little bit about the height component.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the original design that Marty came up with was a very narrow and long building, which was 13 stories. It was much narrower than it needed to be, and it was long and thin, and it was actually a single loaded corridor. So all of the units, the corridor was on every third floor. So there was a lot of through units. So that from the corridor, you went upstairs to one unit, which was a through unit. You went into a smaller unit, or you went downstairs to a through unit. So there were only 4 or 5 corridors out of the 13 floors. So we thought it was a really interesting design, very innovative. And the planning department recognized that it was a very innovative design, but they didn't like it in that location. They were quite insistent that the height step down from the sort of 18 and 20 story buildings that were in the Queen West Triangle down to the residential neighborhood to the north, and down to the CAMH buildings that were to the east. So they were quite insistent. Across the street from the plant is art condos, which is, I believe, 11 stories, if I'm not mistaken, or 12. And so they really wanted that transition from the sort of 18, 20-story buildings in the triangle down to art condos, which is 11. They wanted us to be 10. So it was a kind of a classic squash and spread scenario, where because we couldn't go the 13 stories and we had to stay at 10, the building then got fatter and became more of a conventional double loaded corridor building. So I think still quite interesting. We managed to keep a lot of like daylight in the corridor, for example, but it was a more conventional double loaded corridor as opposed to the skip stop floors and single loaded corridor that we had originally planned for.
And anything else generally about the approval process that you mentioned? I just follow up on something that you mentioned in the introduction.
Yeah, so then what happened was the neighbor to the north was just the landowner objected to, so we did, redesign the building down to 10 stories and submitted our application through consultation with the planning department, came up with a design everyone was satisfied with. And the planning department really wanted us to set back our building 5 meters above the podium. So the podium was right to the property line, but the upper 8 stories were set back 5 meters from the north property line. So we agreed to that. The neighbor to the north objected to our design, just really as a placeholder, really to kind of protect his interests. Then Curated Properties came in and bought the property from the guy on the north, and they were a much more reasonable group to deal with. So they obviously didn't want to just object for the sake of objecting. So they sat down and said, look, we're fine with your project. We're actually going to submit our own application. So we said, great, let's work together. They submitted their application for a 6-story building because they were sort of an in-between site between us and the truly low-rise residential neighborhood, and on a fairly small site. So they stepped up from 4 to 6 stories, which the planning department liked, but they were presenting a blank wall along the south side of the property line. So our 5-meter setback would have looked into a blank wall, which would have been quite unattractive. And so what we sat down with them and said, look, we really, your design's not so great for us. Is there a way we can work out something that will work for both of us? And they had a little inset on their south side where they had some windows. So we said, why don't we basically fill in this gap, this 5.5-meter gap, with an 8-story piece. So now our building will go from 10 down to 8, and then it will go to their 6 and 4. So the planning department really liked that because it gave a transition, a truly stepped building down to the neighborhood. We then got rid of a fairly nasty urban condition, which would have been a 5-meter gap between buildings of looking into a blank wall. So the urban design folks at the city like that. And we actually got extra density because we filled in that gap with an 8-story piece. But in so doing, we wanted to maintain the little cutout they had in their building. So we created a light well on our side, which went all the way down to the ground floor and created a feature in the building. So it was a kind of a win-win-win situation where urban design was quite happy with the sort of stepping of the building and with the way it met the street. Curated was happy because we didn't object to their design, and they actually got this light well, which gave better light into their lower floors. The light well went right through our podium, which we didn't have to do. And we were happy because we actually got a little bit of extra density. So it worked out well. So what could have been a nasty kind of fight at the OMB turned into a very cooperative, neighborly solution. And it was, in fact, so we liked them so much through that process, or we got to know them and thought they were really good guys. We actually asked them to come in as partners in the project. So they became 50% partners in our project. So it's a happy ending.
Yeah, it's a great story, and certainly a nicer ending than we hear a lot of the time in the industry throughout the process. I'm just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about the urban agriculture concept and where that came from. I understand it's related to some of the core pillars of your company, and also wondering if that played any part throughout the approval process and the community engagement piece.
In the approvals process, not so much. The planning department, wasn't that interested in it. Community was sort of interested. I think it really helped in our marketing. It got great press, and the people really responded well to that. And we heard from purchasers that was a big reason that they were attracted to the building. So it came from, the plant itself. Calling it the plant was a bit of a play on words because plant also refers to like a factory, a plant. And so that area was an industrial area. And so when we chose the name the plant, it was sort of a play on words, meaning plant as in ex-industrial building, but also plant as in the green things that grow. For us, urban agriculture was doing many things at once. First of all, it was kind of making people more aware of healthy lifestyle. It was giving people more outdoor space and making more outdoor amenity for the units. So the balconies, as I say, are all oversized, and also created a kind of a healthier life. It creates a healthier lifestyle, but also creates a sense of community in the building. So what we've done there, as I mentioned, the amenity space is in fact a communal kitchen where people can have dinners together, cooking classes, bring in guest chefs, do communal dinners post-COVID at sometime in the future, we hope. But also grow their plants. There's a south wall with a greenhouse, and again, it becomes a sort of a real way to grow community in the building as well as grow plants. So we've even taken it the next step, which is post-construction and post-occupancy, because we think that building communities is more than the bricks and mortar. So rather than just do what is often done, the developer builds the building, walks away, and turns it over to the condo corporation, we actually developed an urban harvest program to teach residents about urban agriculture and about cooking. So we've set up a program with the condo corporation once they got formed to be like an educational program teach them how to garden on balconies, how to do container gardening, and to introduce them to local chefs in the neighborhood who could do cooking classes. So it's a way of really providing programming to implement that vision beyond the sort of physical space and the bricks and mortar that we provided.
That's great. And question from Chris, and just sort of in other words, how would you say the value proposition of the urban agriculture and also the intermodal transportation component contributed to a price premium when you were selling the project? Because I do recall that it was that the price was higher than sort of your typical Queen and Dovercourt area at the time.
Yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really hard to answer because it's, I mean, it's really hard to know what, we did get a bit of a price premium when we went to market, and, the building was more expensive to build for all of those reasons. So we kind of needed that. And it sold very quickly. Like it sold, the take-up was fantastic. But what contributed to that? Was it the design of the building? Was it the urban agriculture? Was it the geothermal system that we put in the building and the energy saving features? Was it its location, the focus on bicycle transportation? Or was it all of the above? So it's really hard to pinpoint what it was that contributed to its success. It was very successful from a sales perspective. So we're very happy about that. It was a sort of a vindication of what we wanted to do. But it's really hard to, I think, to tease out what the big, if there was one driving factor. We've heard anecdotally that people really responded well to the urban agriculture idea. And incidentally, we ourselves got very excited by it. And we're trying to take that further on our new projects as well. Our project in Guelph and the one we're doing on Kingston Road will also incorporate the same focus on food and urban agriculture.
That's fantastic. And then just also to build on that, also the unit composition is different than your typical condo building pre-construction these days. You have larger units, you have two-story condo townhouse style units on upper floors, which is pretty unique. So it seems that you really focused the end user rather than the investor that would then flip to an end user, rent out. So where did that thinking come from?
Yes, well, we are focused more on end users than investor purchasers. I think they're the ones who really value the design efforts we put into projects. Investors tend not to. Investors tend to look totally at these things like products, like commodities, as investments, and don't really care about the quality. So the end user is really our market. We have two-story units on the penthouse, as you mentioned, Lurad, but also on the third floor, we have kind of townhouses in the sky along the podium. So people have huge outdoor terraces there. They're great family units. We have a very high proportion of 2-bedroom units. We even have 3-bedroom units. We even had a 4-bedroom unit. So we really wanted to make it a mixed building that would accommodate families happily. I'm happy to report there are people with young children in the building. So that's a sort of a vindication of that. Not a huge number, but some. And, it's part about making a livable city. The idea was it would be like a true microcosm of a village. So you have all ages and all sort of family types there. So that on top of the fact that it's a mixed use building, it also has retail, it also has office. So we really saw it as a bit of a vertical village. And interestingly, it was very hard to convince the financiers of that. Like the real estate industry, as we all know, is very conservative and tends to want to just repeat past successes. And so if everybody's, selling small 1-bedroom units, then why would you do anything different? So it took a lot of convincing when we were going to seek financing to convince people that a mixed-use building made sense, that bigger units made sense, that 2-bedroom units made sense, that large balconies made sense. But clearly there was a strong response to that, and there's a need for those kinds of units in the city.
I have another question about planning, and maybe you can answer from different projects you worked on. You mentioned that you allowed for much larger balconies and the community kitchen. Have you ever incorporated as part of construction anything that will, as a feature or anything? I just wonder about, from construction perspective, really the technical detail about water, like anything that, your actual design drawings look different as a result of allowing your tenants, buyers to grow fresh vegetation at height. Like this is 10 stories. Do you think it could work in a taller building? Maybe we can open it up a little bit.
It's interesting. I mean, balconies tend to be less habitable the higher you go, just because
Right.
there's wind. So if we were doing a 30-story building, we'd probably reconsider how the balconies were done. You'd probably want to do more inset type balconies, maybe even balconies with partial enclosure, so that you could mitigate, the wind effects. So there's really not a one size fits all. I think it's really important to design in context with the site and the constraints that you're working with. In terms of specific things that we did, I mean, there were a lot of very specific design moves we made. From an energy perspective, for example, like the window to wall ratio is I think 45%. So, glass buildings, it's like 80 or 90%. So we still have very generous daylight in those units, and they're very big windows, but you don't need that much glazing. And that's how you get better thermal performance of the envelope. Another design feature was the shape of the balconies. They're all kind of triangular shape. So at their deepest, they're almost 10 feet deep, but at their narrowest, they're about 2 or 3 feet deep. The reason for that was that it fit with the geometry of the building, kind of moving around a corner, but it also allowed for better daylight penetration to the lower units, because if you have a huge balcony sticking out, it's great for that unit, but it doesn't allow very much light into the unit below. So by having the balconies really triangular shaped, you're giving people, on the one hand, great amenity and great space, but you're cutting it back so that you're allowing daylight to penetrate into the unit below. So there's a lot of thought given by the design team to many aspects of the building.
You just answered another question we had in the Q&A, which is great. The last question we got here in the Q&A is blank walls, and if the city has any urban design, I mean, not guidelines, because I don't think they have guidelines for blank walls, but from your experience, what is the policy or direction that they usually take around blank walls, and how the city treats facing a blank wall? Because you really found a creative solution for something that wasn't even brought up from the planning department. So what can you tell us there?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. So for a lot of, you see this a lot on the mid-rise buildings along the avenues where, a new building is put up and there's kind of blank walls on either side of it. So, on a mid-block connection, it's fairly common. You're going to have blank walls on the party lines on either side of the building, because there's an anticipation that there'll be more mid-rise buildings to follow that will cover up that blank wall. So I would think it's somewhat acceptable if you're the first building on the block, knowing that there's going to be future development beside you, that, if you're building to a property line, you don't really have a choice. It's got to be a blank wall.
Right.
So at least try and, finish it in a way that it's got a nice pattern, or, there's nice materiality to it. In our case, it was different. We had already come up with our design, and there were windows. We didn't have a party wall condition on our property line. We had set back against their property line. Whereas when Curated came along with their initial design, they were putting a blank wall facing our windows. So that's a very different condition, where you're coming along later with a building, responding to a building that's already there and putting up a blank wall. So I think that's something that should not happen from an urban design perspective. So it really depends kind of who's there first, whether the blank wall is there in anticipation of another blank wall that's going to abut it, which is one's condition, as opposed to when you already have an existing building with windows, or a planned building then a blank wall is really not a good design solution.
We got two more questions from the audience that I will ask you. One, were you required to provide an office space on the second floor? Was that out of choice? Obviously, it was pre-COVID. And if it was out of choice, if you can tell us a little bit more about that financially, reasons providing to that.
Yeah, it was out of choice. As I mentioned earlier, in the early kind of vision for the project, we really wanted to keep employment uses in the building. That whole area had been, factories, and we, as much as intensification is a great thing, and it's great to have residential development downtown, we also need places to work. So it was always part of our idea to have an employment uses in the building. And to have this second floor office. It wasn't required. The city now requires it for, I think, bigger developments that are, I think, over 200,000 square feet, or there's some size of development within which the city sort of requires an office component on the lower floors. We were not required. This was voluntary. It was done, as I say, in response to, I guess, more of a sense of responsibility of keeping employment uses downtown. But it's also, the lower floors of the building are challenging from a residential perspective. They're noisier. There's the podium is much deeper, so it's not that feasible to put residential units. So it's a logical thing to have a podium that's much deeper, and an office use or retail at grade are much better uses for those kinds of spaces than residential, frankly. So our first residential floor is the third floor, and they're like garden suites. They're wonderful because they've got a big podium below them, and they have like very large terraces. They almost have like yards outside their units. So there's multiple benefits that happens when you have a large podium with non-residential uses, both from an urban design perspective, mixed use perspective, putting residential units where they're best suited. From a financial perspective, it's less valuable. Like, you get more per square foot for a residential unit than you will for an office space. But on the other hand, you get more area. So we couldn't have put residential units in that deep, of a floor plate. So although the per square foot sale value is less, there's more density there. So in the end, I don't think it's a money-losing proposition. Where the challenge, though, is the risk factor, because you can pre-sell residential units. That's the way it's done in the city. It's very difficult to pre-sell commercial space. So from a financing perspective, what it meant was, because we have to sell 75% of a building in order to get financing before you can build, normally that's 75% of the residential units. In this building, 75% of the building was all the residential units. And we knew we couldn't pre-sell the retail, and we knew we couldn't pre-sell the office because there's just no market for that. So we effectively had to sell 100% of the residential units in pre-sales in order to get financing, in order to build. And then there's the risk factor of, will we find a market? Will there be a market for the office and the retail later? So there's more risk to that. But in the end, fortunately, we found buyers for all the commercial space. In fact, there's only one small unit still left there that's available. If anybody's interested, give me a call.
Yeah, I was just about to say. The last question, it's a very short one. Again, the design of the balconies, angular versus curved. Any rationale behind that, very in brief?
Angular versus curved?
If there was a rationale beyond just design.
Well, curved balconies are very difficult to furnish. They can look nice on a building, but they're, curves are difficult to furnish. So in this case, the angled balconies came about partially because of the geometry of the site, which is sort of a triangular site, and the way the building sits on the site it's just really like a triangular building. So on the one side, there's a kind of a sawtooth facade, but the balcony line is straight. So that creates all these little insets, which created all the triangular balconies. On the east side of the building, it's a straight wall, but we took the mirror image of those balconies and projected them out from the building, again, as triangular balconies. So it was a bit of a play of geometry, just given the site constraints that we had. Sort of really a design move, I would say, by Konchner Architects to do that. But I think that the angular balcony was really functional, as I mentioned earlier, in allowing daylight to the lower units. Because if they would have been just squared balconies, they may have been a bit more easier to furnish, frankly, but they would have been really a problem in terms of allowing proper daylight penetration into the building.
All right, well, that's all of our Q&A questions. Any final closing words that you want to say, Alex, before we wrap up?
Thank you for having me. I always, welcome these conversations. We're actively looking for projects. So if anyone out there is interested in talking to us, we love to partner with people. We love to work with existing landowners, other developers. We've just launched a real estate fund, which we now have kind of a war chest of kind of equity to deploy. It's called the One Planet Living Fund, and we're hoping to take this One Planet Living framework and apply it at much larger scale, both for buildings and larger communities. So we would welcome, those kind of opportunities, and we're actively looking for them.
That's fantastic. It's really exciting and seems like a natural evolution beyond your first several projects. So thank you again, Alex, for taking the time and for sharing your experience with the plant. It's a really unique project, and it's encouraging to see that, with some out-of-the-box thinking and collaborative process with your neighbors, that you can really create something that's unique and special. And I'm sure we'll continue delivering more value into the future. So thank you very much. And thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to kickstart our next series, Nem and myself. Join us on November 2nd, when we're going to welcome Adam Scheffer, CEO of Originate Developments. We're going to talk about his project over at 699 Shepherd Avenue East. So on that, again, thank you very much. Have a wonderful day, and we will